the elements are. We will share with you each 6 months. Here's what we're going to do over the next 6 months. So you'll get that so you can see kind of a larger picture layout. But just note that there's an Excel file that came to you as well that's got the full 2-year process, but we'll update the 6-month process as we go. Before we move on, just want to make sure there aren't any questions about that, any questions about where we are. We're on track to be in great shape, and then we'll move into the conversation for this afternoon.
So before we entertain questions, let me just acknowledge Commissioner Santiago, who is attending the CUBE convention in Las Vegas, but he is joining us, and Commissioner LeBron, Vice President LeBron, will be joining us shortly as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thank you.
So are there any questions moving forward for Ray or for, is it Cindy? Mm-hmm. Cindy? All right.
Seeing none, we'll dive in. So first and foremost, I mentioned to you at the beginning of this process that over the course of time, you are going to come to hate me. You will not like what I have to say. Tonight begins that process. So far it's been easy, but tonight we're going to push back on you quite a bit as we go through tonight's conversation. I think there's very little that I'll share that won't rub at least someone in the room or online the wrong way, but just know that is our job as coaches. So we'll start with a quick review before we get into our conversation. Our agenda for tonight calls for kind of an update of the process, but then going into a board committee diet. But before we begin, I just want us to reflect on what we heard, what we learned during the 2-day process, where we were, where we are now. So we started off by talking about student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And we said that quite a bit. Student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And we asked you the question, which adults have to change first? And what was your response? Say again? The board. Is the board? So the board has to change first? I have to change first? All right, so we talked about I as the genesis of change. The board means that others have to change before I do. So I have to change first. So we talked about student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change, and I have to change. I have to reflect on my actions and my responsibilities. We also asked during that time that you reflect. We said every good coach, win or lose, at the end of the game, every good coach reviews the videotape of the game. Every good coach reviews the videotape of the game. And you remember we asked at the end of that process, when was a time, whether you realize it or not, whether it was obvious or not, but when was a time when your adult behaviors made it more difficult for the district to accomplish its goals for kids? I'll ask that again. When was a time when your adult behaviors, whether you recognize it or not, made it more difficult for the district to accomplish its goals for kids? Does everybody remember that question? So think about that for a moment. When was a time when your adult behaviors made it more difficult for the district to accomplish its goals for kids? And I won't ask you to share, but just think about it for a moment. We started the process with mindset first. We started the process with, we didn't get into kind of board activities. You remember we talked about there's 3 different things. There's mindset, there's knowledge, and there's skills. Part of what we'll take you through today is part of the knowledge and skills process, but we started this whole process with mindset. The reason we started the process with mindset is that it's going to be difficult for you to move through the process if you don't acknowledge that I, as a genesis of change, thank you, I, as a genesis of change, is critical to the process. And so we're here tonight. We originally planned to have a conversation about community listening, and we asked you to fill out a brief 10-minute survey on the community listening process. As of this morning, we had still two members of the board who hadn't filled out that process. But some of them we didn't get until late, too late to actually develop a script and begin the process of community listening. So won't share who, but just want you to know each time, and you as a board have to go through this process. We can't do the work for you. So the community listening process, the feedback process, what you do in terms of moving the board forward is a collective process for the board. We can't do that for you. We'll guide you through the process, but as a board, you've got to do the work. So we've adjusted. Not everyone finished it, and so because not everyone finished it, and not in a timely manner, we can't move forward with that conversation. So we've pivoted. We'll talk about the committee process tonight, but essentially what we've done is now pushed back that community listening process because the full board didn't respond to the survey in a timely manner that will allow us to move forward with community listening. So it's slowed up the community listening process. So I know that you all want to finish the guardrails process and get into monitoring and finish the community listening, but that does require each individual on the board doing their individual part to help the collective board move forward. So again, I as a genesis of change and making sure that you as individuals are helping the board collectively move forward is critical to the process. So you can't move forward if you're not each individually responsible. Yes, sir.
Well, I was one of the ones that submitted mine late, so I want to sincerely apologize to you, both of you.
It's all right. And one of the things that we'll share as we go, you don't have to apologize to us. It's the longer it takes to go through the process, the slower you're getting things in place for your kids. That's the most important thing. Not us, but your kids. So I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. But just know that your commitment to the board is a commitment to your children. So thank you. Thank you for sharing. And thank you for being willing to share. All right. I know that's where we started. We went through some other things that we started that are important for tonight's conversation. So we talked about student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors changed. We talked about reviewing the videotape. So we're going to pivot tonight, and we're going to talk about the committee process that you currently have in place. But before we do, there's a couple of things that are important for setting the context. So as we went through that process, we talked about videotape, but we also talked about inputs, outputs, and outcomes. We talked about inputs, outputs, and outcomes. Who can help remind me, what are inputs? What are inputs? And actually, so that everyone's not staring at me, talk to your partner. Everyone pair up, and Commissioner Simmons and Commissioner Loy and Commissioner Griffin, you all may have to talk together. But everyone talk to a partner in pairs. Talk to your partner about what inputs are. Yep, you can turn your microphones off. Unless Commissioner Simmons, you can go to your right if you like. Just inputs. No reason to go into outputs, but just inputs. What are inputs? All right, we'll bring you back. Who would like to share first? What are inputs? What do you remember about inputs? You're silent. This is a participatory process. Yes, sir.
resources and activities invested in the district.
So resources and activities invested in the district. What are some examples of some? And I know we have two commissioners online. You can feel free to unmute and wade in if you like, because this will be all participatory. So tonight is going to be all participatory, so you might as well get used to it. So give me some examples of some resources. What are some examples of resources that might be inputs?
Social emotional learning.
So social emotional learning. What about social emotional learning?
So putting more counselors in schools or having more social workers in schools.
Okay, counselors, social workers in schools, so staff in schools. What else is an input? Yes, ma'am.
I would think maybe curriculum that we use.
Curriculum that you use. Yes, ma'am. What else? What other examples of inputs?
Finances.
Finances, so the budget, all of the resources that come from taxpayer dollars, bonds, et cetera, all resources. What else? Is it just the social workers and
Teachers and principals.
teachers, principals,
superintendent.
all of the staff. So all of the staff in the district. So inputs. So when we talk about inputs, who's responsible for managing the inputs in the system?
Superintendent.
Superintendent. All right. Superintendent manages the inputs in the system. Let's talk about outputs. What are outputs? So talk to your neighbors. Let's do a quick review of outputs. What are outputs? And you'll understand why we're going here in just a moment.
Quality teaching.
So who would like to share next? Someone that didn't share before. Who would like to share next? What are outputs? What are outputs? Yes, sir.
They're the results of the inputs, for example, the data that comes back on certain things.
So the data that comes back, one of the things that inputs, what are outputs? Outputs are usually knowable at what point of a cycle?
At the beginning and midway. Like
All right, so during the cycle, kind of in the middle of a cycle. So if we're talking about a year being a cycle, and we can talk about multiple 3 years, 4 years, but a year being a cycle, typically the outputs are known in the midst of the cycle. The analogy that we gave was that the outputs might occur at halftime during a basketball game, where I might be able to review the score at halftime. I might be able to review injuries at halftime. I might be able to review which plays are working, which plays are not, so that I can make adjustments. Typically, if we're talking about a basketball game, which was the analogy we used, just bring you back, I know it was a couple of months ago, but a basketball game, we talked about who might make adjustments based on the outputs. So if the outputs are in the middle of a cycle, we talked about who makes adjustments. So who might make adjustments in the middle of a cycle? Go ahead.
So like a classroom teacher, what have you. So if it's like a PDSA cycle, plan, do, study, act.
Yep.
If a classroom teacher puts out tests or quizzes, things of that nature, in the middle of the cycle, if they're checking those things, they can dictate which way their students are going and kind of pivot and say, hey, my students are not learning these basics here. I need to pivot and do something different to ensure they're reaching their goal.
Yep, so a teacher can make adjustments to say, hey, I'm in the midst of a quarter or midst of a semester or midst of a unit. I might give an exit ticket or I might give an end-of-unit assessment that allows me to make adjustments within the cycle. The same occurs at each level of a school district. So just like a coach in a basketball game might make adjustments at halftime, typically those aren't adjustments that are made by somebody else, but the coach is making those adjustments. The same thing occurs for principals, the same thing occurs for principal supervisors, same thing occurs for district staff, district administrators, superintendent. They might make adjustments in the midst of a cycle because they recognize, hey, we need to make adjustments. Things during the year aren't going the way we anticipated, so we're going to make some adjustments. So typically, and in a school system overall, again, those outputs are also monitored by the superintendent, and the superintendent uses those to make adjustments to the inputs. So typically that occurs during the course of the year. Now, tell me lots of different characteristics about outcomes. There's a bunch of stuff you should cover about outcomes. But tell me about outcomes and talk to your partner about outcomes and what those outcomes are.
I can't find it. I already tried. I checked both phones for it. Trying to find your sheet.
You're trying to find a cheat sheet. Well, by the time we get to the end of the process, it'll be ingrained. So that's the idea. That's why we're going back over it.
Measuring the student outcome, the results, how are they doing?
James. State assessments. Just repeat it. Hours?
All right. Tell me everything there is to know about outcomes. Tell me everything there is to know about outcomes. What are they? Say again? I'll pick on everybody. So yes, sir.
Well, I think there was a discrepancy between student outcomes and outcomes, so I don't want to say what our board goals are because those are student outcomes. But the outcomes, in a sense, are the results of both quantitative and qualitative based off of your inputs and your outputs that you have provided the system in order to help you reach the student outcomes.
So it's those outcomes that are the results, the ultimate results of the system. It's what the system produces. But I'll go back to where you started. Where you started is you said there's a discrepancy. Just want to clarify, not a discrepancy, but there's different types of outcomes. There's adult outcomes that the system produces, and there's student outcomes that the system produces. So it's not that they're discrepant, but they're two unique, completely different things. The adult outcomes and the student outcomes. So perfect. What else? What else about outcomes?
I think it's easy for districts to be, or for people to become focused on, at least I'm sometimes focused on adult outcomes instead of the student outcomes. See how I changed that to an I statement?
She changed that to an I statement. Perfect. And the statement was I can sometimes easily be focused on adult outcomes rather than student outcomes. How do we define student outcomes? How do we define student outcomes? What are they?
Student-focused results. These are things
Student-focused results.
that are measurable to the students. So graduation rates, that's a student outcome. Our student readiness, that's a student outcome. So anything that's focused on the student at the core, I believe is a student outcome.
Okay, so things that are focused on the student as a core.
Right.
You gave
Like
an
an
example.
adult can do transportation, that's kind of an adult piece, but the adult actions need to lead to student outcomes.
The adult
ultimately.
actions need to lead to improvements in student
Right.
outcomes. Yep, exactly. How else do we define student outcomes?
Well, they're actual measures of what students know or are able to do.
So we define student outcomes as measures of what students know or are able to do. So student outcomes are measures of what students know or are able to do. So we distinguish, yes ma'am, Commissioner Griffin.
But wouldn't you say that leadership affects the student outcomes?
There are lots of things that affect student outcomes. So lots of inputs. So we talked about all those inputs, principals, leadership, superintendent's cabinet, all of the staff in the district. They're all a part of the inputs. They all absolutely impact student outcomes. They influence the system and the structure and how the system operates. And then ultimately, you can measure their effectiveness by looking at outputs to make adjustments in how you strategize and organize all of those inputs. But ultimately, it's student outcomes that you care most about. I'm asking these questions, and we'll get into it in detail in a moment, but asking all this as a refresher, because it has everything to do with how the board structures itself. Understanding inputs, outputs, outcomes, adult outcomes, student outcomes, has everything to do with how the board structures itself. Now, what did we say, who did we say was responsible for establishing the long-term vision? So you remember we talked about the board as being elected members of the community, and the board's role is to represent the vision and the values of the community. Remember we talked about that? The board's role is to represent the vision and the values of the community. We translate that vision into what we call what? We translate that vision into goals. What kind of goals? Any goals? Say again. Smart goals. What else? Smart goals and student outcome goals. So we translate that vision. That vision is, here's what our community expects for our students. Here's what our community wants for our students. And we translate that vision into goals. And that is the board's responsibility, to translate the vision of the community into goals. And we talked about values. So the community has values, things that they feel deeply about. We translate those board or those community values into what for the board? What we call guardrails. We translate that into what we call guardrails. I'll speak up. So I apologize for, don't want to be whispering to you, but I can now hear myself, so I will talk into the microphone. So we translate the community vision into goals, and we translate the community's values into guardrails. We're in the process of creating those. So over the next couple of months, you're going to listen to the community to get into understanding the vision, the values. Now, as the board creates that process, one of the things that we also talked about when we met a few months ago is we talked about board work versus superintendent work. We talked about board work versus superintendent work. Does anybody remember? Now I'm really going to test your memory. Does anybody remember what we said was board work? Anybody remember the definition of board work? Anyone remember the definition of board work? What is board work? There are 3 characteristics of board work. You hire the superintendent, that's one of the things the board does, but it's not broadly board work. There's one thing so board work, there's 3 elements of board work. Set policies around.
Superintendent said this, I'm not taking it.
You're cheating, giving the superintendent says, the board sets policies. But what is board work? Yes, ma'am.
Ensuring that
making sure that making sure the superintendent is following the guidelines or the steps to reach the goals that the board has set.
So to hold the superintendent accountable for and helping to monitor that the district is making progress against the goals the board has set.
Right.
Okay, yep, absolutely. So there's three things. The first of which is what you just said. The first of which is board work, is the board is responsible for setting the what for the district?
The vision,
The vision, which is tied to the what?
Goals.
goals,
Goals, which are what kind of goals?
smart,
outcomes.
student-focused
Student
goals.
focused, student outcomes focused
Outcome-based
goals, well, which is a measure of what students know are able to do. That's number one. So the board is responsible. So board work is anything that's related to the setting of goals, the setting and monitoring of goals
Yeah.
that the district has set related to the vision for students. What do you think a second thing is? Give you a hint. I just gave it to you a couple of seconds ago. So goals was one that we talked about. This, say it.
Guardrails.
Guardrails. So the values. So board work is anything that's related to the values and the guardrails that the board has set. There's one other element, and I'll go ahead and give it to you because it's going to come up in our conversation this afternoon. Anything that's required of the board by law is board work. Does that make sense? Anything that's required of the board by law is board work. So if there is a statute that says the board must do this, that is board work. Those three are the only things that are board work. All other work is the work of the superintendent. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? Because now you're about to put that into practice. Are there any questions about that? So what's board work? Anything related to what?
Setting or monitoring the goals.
Setting or monitoring goals. Setting guardrails, which is identifying the values of the district.
Anything required by law.
Anything required by law. That is board work. Yes, there are other things that fall under that. You set policies around that. So you'll absolutely set policies around board work. You'll set policies around the work that how you as a board interact with each other. All of those things are board work, but it's all part of the board doing the board's work. So now we dive into our real conversation. So with that review, we dive into our conversation. Take a moment and everyone write down on your own notebook or a scratch sheet of paper and put a little space in between it because I'm going to have you answer some questions about each one of these, and then we're going to talk to your partners about them, and then we'll have a report out and a conversation. So I want you to start by writing down all of the committees of the Rochester City School District and put some space in between them. Write down all of the committees of the Rochester City School District. And for those of you who are online, please do the same, and we'll ask you to come off of mute for this part of the conversation so that you all can be a part of the conversation. So go ahead and everyone, both online and in person, please write down all of the committees of the Rochester City School District and put some space in between them because I'm going to have you write down you're going to fill in some information about each of the committees. Are they able to hear? She's writing? Perfect. All right? If you've written down those three things, I want to ask you three questions. Well, actually, one question, but it's got three elements. Does this committee focus solely on board work? Does this committee focus solely on board work? It is a yes or no question. Does this committee focus solely on board work? It is a yes or no question. And the answer can only be yes if all of the work of the committee focuses solely on board work. Can't be tangentially related to board work. You can't make the argument, well, occasionally we have this conversation that goes into what might be described as board work. It has got to be solely that committee is focused on board work. Yes, ma'am. If you, and you all can
So-
feel free to
Yeah.
ask questions, and I'm going to
Okay,
have you
so
talk to each other.
We established that board work is setting and monitoring of goals, monitoring values and guardrails, or setting values, or
And
setting
monitoring,
guardrails.
yes.
Or anything that's required
Or anything that's required of the board by
by
law.
law. So what if the committee meets one of the three things that are outlined there? Does that count?
It counts.
Okay,
If it meets one of those things, but it's got to be solely and wholly devoted to meeting one of those three things.
Okay.
So in other words, it can't be that once a year this committee has a conversation that addresses one of those three. It has to be that one of those committees is devoted, that all of the work of the committee is devoted to what is the work of the board.
okay,
Does that make sense?
yep.
Any other questions? It is a yes or no question. Any questions? Go ahead and respond for each of those committees if you haven't done so already. So for each of those committees, go ahead and respond. Clerk Nguyen. Stay there, I'll come to you. All right. For our two colleagues that are online, recognize that you can't have this conversation, but we'll ask you to wait in just a moment in person. So if you could give us just a second, I'm going to have the colleagues who are here in the room to have a few-minute conversation about why they responded to each of those questions in the way they did. And then we will open up the floor for a broader conversation, and we'll take each of the committees one at a time, answer that first question, and then we'll go into a little more detail. So with your partners, with your colleagues, have a conversation about whether you said yes or no to that question of whether or not the committees, so does this committee focus solely on board work, meaning the board's goals, meaning what students know are able to do. I know you haven't adopted guardrails yet, but envision that you have adopted guardrails, which are the district's values, and I know you haven't done it yet, but just envision whether or not that committee would address those. And then lastly, whether or not that committee is required by state law to be performed. Have a conversation with your partners at your side. Just verify that you have the same response. If you have different responses for any of the items, being yes or no, have a quick conversation about why your responses are different, and then we'll open up the floor for everyone to share, and we'll take one committee at a time, and we'll go through and address whether you had yes, no, or if you had no, why you had no, if you had yes, why you had yes. Does that make sense to everyone? And we'll have our colleagues online join us in just a moment.
Dr. Hart, were you right here, you were asking if we believe the committee is required by law, or? Okay.
Yes, if
All
the
right.
committee is required by law.
Okay, so not necessarily things within the committee, but just the committee
It could be
itself?
things, it could be things within the committee are
Okay.
required by law.
Okay.
However, it would have to be all of the things in the committee, meaning that that committee only meets to address the issues that are required by law of the board. Does that make sense?
So as we're functioning, not in the la-la land as we should be, but like as we're at, like, are we using the committee? Am I getting too literal? I'm probably getting too literal.
Well, you're saying as you use the committee, but yes, meaning that everything that this committee was structured to do is required of the board by law.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Wait, so I just need some more clarification. I'm sorry. So what if like 3/4 of what the committee does is stuff that is prescribed by law? But the committee itself isn't mandated by law. This is similar to what, I know, I know you just answered this, but we're required to have an internal and external auditor in our district. Okay, that is required by New York State law.
Yes.
Right, so if the audit committee deals with topics relating to our audits, then it would follow that that would be required by law.
So I think the first question you ask yourself is the committee required by law? And then what I shared earlier is 100% of what the committee does required by law. If it's a portion, then we'll have a conversation about it. But if it's a portion, then it is not fully required by law. And there might be other ways to deal with it, which is part of the conversation we're going to have tonight.
Thank you. That changes everything.
All right, raise your hand if you had an opportunity to discuss all the committees that you've written down. So we want, have you all had an opportunity to discuss all the committees that you've written down? Have you had an opportunity to discuss all the committees that you've written down? Mhm. So did you have a chance to discuss the yeses or nos? You're in disagreement? Okay. Yeah, question? Or you want to, are you okay to move forward with a full discussion? Okay, all right. That's okay. All right, we will have a full discussion. At this point, we'll ask our colleagues online to wade in. If you could raise your hand if you'd like to make a point. Madam Clerk, if you don't mind letting us know when someone online would like to weigh in, we'll be happy to share. So, beg pardon? Okay, has raised his hand. Okay. Commissioner, so before we begin, we'll ask you to, we'll answer Commissioner Santiago's question, but which committee would you like to address first? Audit. So audit committee. All right. Audit committee is a good place to start. Commissioner Santiago, you have a question before we talk about audit, or is this a question that you'd like to wade into related to getting us started on that conversation?
No, I thought that we were starting the conversation.
Perfect.
But I can start if you don't mind.
Go ahead. So, get us. You can feel free to get us started.
Yeah, so I'll say for the audit committee, I think it is mandated by law for us to have the auditors, but not specifically audit committee. And we don't meet much with this committee. We meet every once and again, which could really be done inside of the full board meeting. And so for this one, I was kind of on the fence because part of me says yes because of the legal requirements around the work of audit, but the purpose of an entire committee is what I question. And so for my answer, I'll say no for this one.
Okay. That's a great way to get us started. So, what he mentioned was he'll say no. So, there's a couple of things to point out. As he shared on your website, one of the things that you note for your audit committee is that your audit committee is actually required by law. Is the first line of your purpose for the audit committee. Now, one of the things that you have to ask yourself, and this will be the second question that we ask, so we'll go here now that you've had an opportunity to put yes or no. If something is required by law, then you can say yes, this is board work, it is required by law. However, you can make two decisions about each of the committees, or three, technically three. There are three decisions that you'll make about each of these committees. One of them is keep the committee. You keep it because it's required by law, something is needed. Second is the committee needs to be modified. By modified, I mean, as Commissioner Santiago just shared, it could be that portions of the committee are required by law, but then the committee has ventured into other places that really aren't board work, they're more superintendent work, or they aren't related to goals, guardrails, or something that's required by law. In that case, we will label it as modify. Does that make sense to everyone? And then we'll revisit it for modification. And then finally, if it is not one of those three that I suggested, then we'll say, we'll open up the floor for conversations about sunsetting the committee. But in this particular case, are there things, so Commissioner Santiago and to the full board, what you mentioned is that there are things that are required of you by law in the audit committee. Is the audit committee itself required by law, or are elements of what you talk about in the committee required by law? And Mr. State Monitor, you may want to weigh in on that as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I'll let somebody else answer the question because I don't know if the legislation or the law says specifically audit committee or the work that we do in the audit committee. So I'll let somebody else take that.
Okay. Yes, Commissioner Malloy.
Yeah, I believe under New York State law, the committee itself is not required. but the district is required to have both an internal and external audit taking place each year. The internal audit can be hired out to someone else. We have an in-house auditor, but then there's also an external auditor that we hire as well.
Okay, perfect.
So those are required by law, but not the committee itself.
Okay. And there's one other thing I'll add about the audit process and the audit committee. Just want to give verification on, is anyone else, I know your attorney is not here tonight. Beg your pardon? Okay, so Commissioner.
Yeah, I'm here.
I just wanted to see if she was off mute. So Commissioner LeBron, you have your name up, and then did you want to weigh in on that after she finishes?
Okay, I got the floor.
Yes, ma'am.
So it's my understanding the audit committee itself is actually required by law. We're not required to do 100% audits. At one point, districts across were, and then it's my understanding that New York State changed that. And so now it's like a sample, which is how we pull our audits. We're also not required to have internal auditors. We did at one point. When I first started, we did, but that caused some issues as well. There's the committee for the audit is different from any other committee that we currently have in terms of structure. We're also required to have outside auditors serve on that committee or people familiar with finances. So there's some criteria as well that the law sets for school boards and who can serve on that committee. Now, does the committee need to meet 4 times a year? No, the law does not structure and tell us how often the committee needs to meet, but it absolutely needs to meet at least once or twice a year. That's all.
Thank you, ma'am. Before we turn to State Monitor Alicia, I'll share one other thing, and that is for all of your committees, one of the questions that you can also ask yourself is, does this committee have a clearly identified start date and a clearly identified ending date so that the committee has a period in which it is useful, but outside of that period, the committee doesn't need to meet, meaning that the committee doesn't need to meet in perpetuity. So you might have an annual process or a biannual process of audit, I'll say annual, where the committee starts on this date, the committee ends on this date at the end of the audit process, and then it will start on and end at the same period the following year. So that's one of the modifications that you can make to the committee structure. Yes, sir.
It is my understanding as a former superintendent, audit committee is required by law in your state.
Okay. And so it is our understanding as well from reviewing your state guidelines. So you remember we started off the process by saying, is a committee, 1, required by law? 2, is it related to your goals or guardrails? 2, is it related to your goals or guardrails? In this case, the audit committee is apparently required by law. So there are things that you can augment or modify about it. But this is one where we would generally say, keep the committee, but put in a pile for modification / keep / modify for a future. Commissioner Patterson and then Commissioner Simmons.
Yeah, so I oversee audit, and we've already modified it since I've been on the board. As a matter of fact, when I came back from the Council of Great City Schools training, I spoke with our Auditor General and asked her that she, back off or not have so many meetings that wasn't necessary. So we have done that, but can we modify even further, which I hope we do? Absolutely.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Commissioner Simmons?
Yeah, I actually have, out of all the committees listed, audit as the only, yes, because it's legally required by law. And although many of our committees touch on things that fall within scope of board duties, they're not required by law, and there are other ways to execute those services, if you will. But yeah, I do think audit could probably be modified, and it's something we could look at, how to mainstream it and make sure that it is focused where it needs to be. But that's literally the only committee that I identified as a yes.
Okay. And that's a pretty good segue to the next committee, if everyone's finished with audit.
Yeah, one more thing before I leave. So our Auditor General is very specific relative to what's supposed to be reported out. So I know for a fact we're not reporting on things that we really shouldn't be reporting on. But again, can it be cut back? I do agree that even more so than it has been cut back, the reports. So
Okay. Yes, Commissioner Santiago.
Yes, with the update on the legislation, my answer will change to yes. The modification, of course, has to happen, but I will also say that there hasn't been many times that the substance of the committee has been outside of what has been audited. Besides, maybe some political add-ins from some of the commissioners, which of course that can always be removed. But as far as the subject matter of the committee, I haven't seen much of it going off track. And so, of course, we can look at it and look at the modifications for it, but I believe that it's been on subject besides some political add-ins from some of our commissioners.
Okay. If you didn't understand him, I'll repeat. He said, for the most part, the committee has been focused on specifically the auditing functions. So I'm paraphrasing shortly, but he said rarely have they drifted from that focus. There may be some modifications, but for the most part, the committee has been focused. Any other questions about that? So now we'll go on to the next committee. I'll let you all decide which one. The other thing I'll share, just as a reminder, is we got here by talking about inputs, outputs, and outcomes, right? And we connected outcomes to student outcomes. We connected the student outcomes to the goals of the district and also guardrails. So remember, anything that's inputs or outputs is the superintendent's responsibility. Not the board. So it's not board work, it's superintendent work. So keep that in the back of your mind as we have the conversation as well. Any suggestions on the next committee you'd like to address? And it can be any one that you think is easy, one you think is hard. Yes, sir, Commissioner Santiago.
I think it would be good to continue on with the ESA committee. I just want to say for me personally, I did put yes. Not just because of legal requirements, but you also said the board duties. And one of our duties is to monitor, and I believe that the ESA does that as far as monitoring, doing the monitoring of our goals and where we're going. I also think that with some of these committees, if the substance from the committees was added into our regular business meetings, our business meetings would be going from 6 to 12 o'clock at night. And so I believe with this committee, what it's doing is actually going over the monitoring. Sorry, I'm a little sick. Of our goals.
Okay. So for the purpose of the community that might be listening or listening to the stream, this is the Equity and Student Achievement Committee. It was ESA committee, but Equity and Student Achievement Committee. Everyone comfortable with talking about that one next? All right. So Commissioner Santiago shared that this is a committee that might be focused on your monitoring of your goals. Anyone else care to weigh in on whether you said yes or no for ESA committee, Equity and Student Achievement Committee? Yes, ma'am. Commissioner Griffin?
I have to agree. I believe that that particular committee gives us a lot of information and updates that are crucial to knowing that we are meeting the goals that we set forth, but that the superintendent has given, and that the things that we're trying to meet as well as a board for the student outcomes.
Okay.
I think the committee does do a lot of monitoring. I believe that committee needs to be modified. I think it can be more focused. So although I think a lot of great work comes out of it, and I'm not being biased, I think it certainly could be modified to make more sense.
Commissioner Patterson. Thank you, Commissioner Simmons.
Yeah, again, I think that committee does present a lot of good information, but again, it's not a requirement that it be a committee, so I said no.
Okay. So it's not required by law.
Correct.
But You could say yes if the committee is wholly and totally focused on your goals, on monitoring your goals or monitoring your guardrails. So I hear two members saying that the committee is wholly and entirely focused on monitoring goals or monitoring guardrails, since it's not required. Agreement is not required by law. Is
We
that
agree on
correct?
what?
Do we agree it's not required by law?
Yes, we
that's an
do.
agreement.
Okay.
We do. I do agree that it can be modified, though.
Okay.
I do agree that it could be scaled back. I do agree
So it
with
could be
that.
scaled back.
Yeah, I do agree with that.
So
I-
are all commissioners members of that committee?
It's a committee of the whole.
It is committee of the whole, okay?
Yeah, all of our committees are committees of the whole,
Okay.
all of them.
And Commissioner Santiago, you were about to share?
Yeah, I would say it could be modified too, but not specifically on cutting back, but specifically on focus on our goals and the goals that we have in place.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Commissioner Malloy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that this is a committee that we'd want to keep, but it does need to be modified and set up in a manner so that we're actually doing or engaging in the progress monitoring process. And I think sometimes, although we get a lot of data from this committee, sometimes there's just so much there in the time that we have. Maybe we need to meet more often, who knows? But I think that there are times when there's more of an adult focus versus the actual student outcome goal focus.
Okay. So if it's adult focused and it's not related to the goals, that would be outside the scope. The other thing that I'll share as well is keep in mind with each of these committees, there's different ways of getting the same information. So you can do it in a committee structure or you can do it in other structures as well. So we can talk more about that as well.
Yeah, not to belabor it, but yes, I think it can focus on the goals that we have, the district goals, which are the 4 key goals. And then to your point, there is maybe some other information we need. Those things can be modified by a report. And we can absorb certain aspects of the committee into other, maybe the business meeting somewhere. But I definitely think there's opportunity there to make more sense of it. And then we need to just figure out what needs to be harvested. Because the data is great, but I think by 9 o'clock, everybody's eyes are crossed. So data's only as good as the people, being able to even absorb it, so.
And just so you know, I know this is preliminary. You wanted to have this conversation earlier in the process. You remember I had mentioned to you that we normally have this conversation kind of later in the process after you've gone through monitoring what it looks like, et cetera. We'll be working very closely with the administration to adjust what monitoring looks like for you, what those data presentations look like. Monitoring is really a 5-page report with a few data slides that are specifically related to the goal or the interim goal that you're monitoring. It is not a data dump. So it is not a 50 slides of all the district's data all at once, because your eyes will glaze over. And quite often, all of those slides would be tangential to the actual conversation that you want to have that evening. So that's a process that we'll share with the district. So in terms of understanding where you're going with that, that's something that we'll address. So we've got keep and modify for this committee. So it's yes. Let me ask you this question. How much of the conversation in the committee is related to presentations from district staff about things like curriculum or staffing, things like that? How much is that a part of what happens during these conversations?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes? Okay, go ahead, Superintendent, and then I'll follow up on that question.
I think everyone around the table knows that ESA is one of my biggies because it's all about teaching and learning. But I was going to say, unfortunately, the committee lends itself to board interfering with inputs, even with the questions that are being posed. Some questions that are not necessarily even related to the content that's being presented, but it often then results in trying to, or inadvertently, because I want to assume best intent, sway what is being presented in order to produce different outcomes of some sort. And so, I did want to acknowledge that, yes, it is a committee that I most certainly believe could be, continue to be powerful in focusing on student outcomes. However, It is the one committee that really, that's where my work is impacted the most.
Okay.
And not necessarily for the good, if
Okay.
you will.
May I speak
So,
up? Oh.
so I think we've got one hand online, which I can't see, and then we'll go Commissioner Griffin, Commissioner Malloy. Who's online? Commissioner Santiago.
Yeah, and so I would agree with some modifications that's tailored to our board goals. And I think that the committee should be kept, and it should be focused on, the how, us looking at the progress of that, and even moving some of it to the business meeting is something that I object, because the business meetings are usually already super long, and then we add this, we're talking about crossing eyes, and I think with adding this to a board meeting, to a business meeting, it continues that, super long meeting where some of the information that's being shared, some people may not be catching because of how long the meeting is.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Commissioner Griffin.
I guess my concern is this, when we have these meetings, and specifically when we have the ESA meetings, the information that's being presented, I guess, it becomes cumbersome because the points that we are looking for over and over again that we ask about is not really there. It could be an excellent presentation, but for me personally, the information is like repeated, but it's like you heard it before, but you're not seeing the progress. As you know, maybe that's for me. I don't see a great progress. I see a difference, but not a progress where we should be going in the right direction. I feel, and I know things move. It takes time for change, but I guess I just don't. All the pieces are not coming together when I see these presentations. I think they're just all over the place, So that's what bothers me. And then when you're trying to ask a question, you don't want to feel like you're attacking anyone.
Right.
But you're not giving me the answers that I need that show me that it's student outcome focused. If that's what we're driving at, and we all have goals on both sides, and the superintendent and the board, where is it? Because I don't see it. All I see is failure in a lot of instances. I don't see, with the district as a whole, where I see the positive. And I'm just being honest. So that's why it's baffling to me that we keep going through these presentations, and I'm really not getting anything out of it as much. Some of them have been really good, and some of them I see some differentials. But overall, it becomes cumbersome.
Okay. Before you go, Commissioner Malloy, may I respond with two things? The first of which is perfect. One of the things that we'll work with when we come in on November 25th and 26th, what we'll work with the administration on is how do you adjust those presentations for monitoring purposes to help the board understand here's the information that needs to be presented, and we're going to work with the board on what questions do you ask and why. So how do you ask questions? What does a good monitoring conversation with the superintendent look like? You will not get it right the first time. You will not get it right the second time, but we'll work with you as you go to transition. Here's what we're looking for. Here's how we begin to transition what gets presented. The second thing I'll share, which is important, quite often, and I was with a board on Saturday, all day Saturday, and the same topic came up. And the board I was with on Saturday, they said, we have meetings with the administration, and they present to us things like the curriculum, or they present how teachers are doing things, et cetera. And what they said is, as a board member, if I get that presentation, you're asking me to comment on how are you deploying your teachers, how are you doing your professional development, how are you monitoring how are you selecting the curriculum? So one of the things that we'll work on is what's the elements of those presentations that give you as a board the information that you need to have a conversation about at the board level about whether or not the district is making progress, but at the same time not invite, if you get a presentation on the curriculum, it's asking you to comment on the curriculum.
That's right.
And so we recognize that. That's part of the process that we'll work on with the administration. Does that help?
Yes, sir, thank you.
Commissioner Malloy, and then Vice President LeBron, and then Commissioner Simmons.
So you really hit on what the comment that I was going to make, because I think that although we're getting what I think is a lot of really valuable information from the ESA meetings, lots of data, lots of descriptions about the really wonderful deployment of how we're adjusting or deploying different curriculum across the board. So it's great information, but it does open the door for a lot of heated discussions or back and forth between board members at times, and it isn't necessary. It's a lot of the inputs in the system, so it lends itself to even more questions being asked, and at least that's been my experience for the last few years. I would like to think, just even as a teacher, I love listening to all these presentations about curriculum, and I want to ask questions. I want to, dive into it and understand like how things are being deployed. But I'm realizing that that isn't exactly student outcome focused, that those are more the inputs that I'm focusing on then by asking those questions. So thank you.
Yep, we will work on that. Go Vice President LeBron and Commissioner Simmons.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in on ESA, and for me, the majority of these committees could go. I do want to point out to something Commissioner Santiago said about our board business meetings being long, and that is because we start the meetings with these reports being read. No other district does these things, including the parent reports. We just don't read those out. We make them available. Other districts make them available, but I do think there is a lot of modification that needs to actually happen in our board business meeting, which would make room for these conversations to be properly fitted in there, and thus creating a whole lot less meetings. Because here's the thing, I've been on this board 7 years with 2 different configurations of these meetings and meeting committees that have existed and don't exist. And the outcomes have been the same, point blank, period. And they were the same 20 years ago. They were the same 10 years ago, 5 years ago, last year. For me, none of this is actually ever even touching student outcomes because of the structure as it stands.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And that's one of the things that you'll note that we do have this is on the color-coded implementation plan that you have. Item number 9 is actually board agenda redesign. And we had put it on here to start the conversation around the December, January, February timeframe. But as you start to monitor, and one of the things we can do is put this particular item on the keep/modify list. And so it's one that we can keep, modify for now. But just note, as you begin to think through the board agenda redesign, you can, Vice President LeBron, think about, all right, what are things that we can do differently in that board agenda process that might, as you shared, make more room for these conversations in that meeting, and subsequently get you to a place where you might be able to sunset or modify this committee significantly. Commissioner Simmons, and then we'll move on to the next committee.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of helpful information. And I think, again, to the point around like we don't see progress, that's the reality of our district, and that's what this committee reveals, and that's why, I asked for the data that I asked for, because we need to monitor how we're doing, and if we're not doing well, then we need to see it so that we can change some things. But some of the stuff, we do have to just lighten the load, right? And so when we talk about how cumbersome this particular committee is, it lends to what you're saying around the questions we ask, and even myself as the committee chair, when when I first started, as I'm becoming more sophisticated as a commissioner, I'm recognizing, oh, wait a minute, a lot of these questions are in the weeds, but I think the administration over the years has accommodated these questions and then begin to anticipate what it was we wanted to see as board members. They want to know disaggregate the data, aggregate the data,
Right.
do this, do that. And so then they begin to embellish this. Then you have a 50, 30 slide
Yep.
presentation. And so to the point, if we begin to modify this to the point where it is a substantive succinct number of slides, 5 slides or less, whatever the case is, and we're hitting at the core of what it is we need to see, we can find another way to do this. So I do want to, again, make sure we are understanding this can be digestible, not as it stands, but with proper modification. I just want to emphasize that.
Okay, so for the Equity and Achievement Committee, I've got keep, modify. Does anyone disagree with that? Is that the consensus?
No.
Commissioner Patterson?
I think
Yep,
it's
for
keep
me, it's
modify.
like-
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
For me, it's, and again, I always go back to, I think it was Einstein that said insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So for me, we have to be willing to do things differently. That even I've learned, I'll speak for myself, since I've been on the board, right? I only know, what I'm taught, what I hear. But I'm always open and receptive to change and adapting to change, and we have to be willing to do that on this board if we're going to move ahead. One thing you said earlier, and I was always against committee of the whole when I first came onto the board. So we talk about a committee diet. I am definitely looking forward to that. And you said something earlier. What are these structures or other ways of reporting out? And I think in these committees that we have to discuss that there are, which I don't know, I'll speak for myself. I don't know what those ways are, and I'm very happy to learn. But we have to find other ways of reporting out that doesn't involve the committee of the whole or these committees itself.
Okay.
So thank you.
So we're saying the same thing, I think, Commissioner Patterson, but for myself, I'm going to say, what I was going to finish out saying is I do think it is keep, modify with a plan to sunset.
And for all of these committees, and that's what I was about to add, but for all of these committees, you will need a sunset process because some of them will involve things that the board still wants to get updates on. So where the superintendent will still have to say, if we're going to make, major changes, for example, in transportation, I don't want to make major changes in transportation without filling in the board on what the district is thinking about, but it's not something you need a committee for. It's something you need a different communication process for. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So all of them will involve a sunset process. So Commissioner Simmons, I like the way you put it, keep, modify for now, and as we move forward, look at the possibility of sunsetting. Makes sense for everyone? In the meantime, what we'll do is we will work with both the administration as we go forward around changing what those presentations look like, and then also work with you all as a board as you begin to modify the kind of the board agenda on when and at what place does it make sense to transition. Yes, ma'am. So Vice President LeBron, you had your hand up, and then Commissioner Santiago.
I think he had his up first, though, so I want to give him that grade. It's numbered for us. Okay. I don't know if he's still up, but
Go ahead, Vice President.
okay. Sorry, sorry, Isaiah. Yeah, to the point of that was just mentioned. Like I support keeping, modifying, sunsetting. I just wanted to point out too that this is what work sessions are for committee. Like, we don't need a committee on all these things, that we can also factor in work sessions on those topics. Like you were just mentioning, transportation, for example, if there was a new plan that the superintendent wanted to present to the board, we can agree on a date to host a work session, which, as our attorney often says, a meeting is a meeting, so it would still be a meeting that would have to have quorum and be called to question and all those things. But I think some of these topics that you sort of keep bringing up, that, there are going to be times superintendents want to present stuff to the board, get their opinion, their information. That all can be done through work sessions. That's all.
Thank you, ma'am. And yes, and we'll talk about that at the end of today's process as well, because one of the things we're going to talk about is next steps. And in next steps, we're going to talk about how you all want to move forward with us, given next steps. So Commissioner LeBron, that is something that we will raise. Commissioner Santiago.
I just agree with, I agree with the conversation overall. I thought we were getting ready to go to the next topic, so.
Okay. Anyone else on this particular committee?
I would support right now modifying it, but then with the intent to move maybe towards work sessions instead, and eventually sunsetting the committee.
Okay. Did everyone hear what Commissioner Malloy shared? All right. Anyone else before we?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what she said.
Just said that supporting the same, I think, consensus. I think there's consensus around modifying for now this committee with the idea of moving forward with board work sessions and ultimately trying to get to a place of sunsetting. Is that correct?
I'm sorry to jump in like this. Where would, because there are some things in the committee that are required by, is it by law? I think what the state monitors piece is, you know, so some of these monitoring reports or do they have to, can they be just given as reports or do they have to be presented? Like they're due at certain times and we're obligated to make sure that information comes out, but
By legislation, I'm required to do some presentations to the board. So that's part of the legislation.
But it doesn't have to be in this committee, correct?
No,
Okay.
to the board.
So we'll open the floor now to the next committee. What's the next? Okay, Commissioner Malloy.
The committee that I currently chair, which is HC, or Human Resources, we call it Human Capital here.
Yes.
And it's not required by law, and we are not focused on student outcomes nor guardrail setting. So if any committee needs to be sunset, I would agree. Great topics leads to many debates and questions and sometimes arguments, unfortunately. This is a committee I think that we can sunset, and if we need to have, one thing I love about the committee is that, you know, we do learn more about our equity in hiring processes that we're engaged in. That's a goal of within this, kind of a sub-goal within this district. But that can be presented, I think, in more of a work session setting. So if anything has to be sunset immediately, I would say the HC committee.
So Commissioner Malloy has put forth sunsetting the Human Capital Committee. So that is being the next committee. One thing I will share as well, you mentioned that the committee provides valuable updates around equity and hiring, et cetera. But again, I would note that is solely inputs and solely the superintendent's work. In addition to that, updates on that might be valuable, but having a committee that meets on a regular basis to get updates on that, which aren't going to change as frequently as you might think, would be something that you all should consider. So right now, Commissioner Malloy has shared sunset that committee.
I do want to say, though, that Human Capital, the entire department, does valuable work in this district, and I support the hardworking people who are on a daily basis trying to make our district better, and it's important work.
I think
it's not board work.
Yep. So I think from a standpoint of human capital being important, the bulk of your district's budget is spent on human capital. So they are the bulk of what you do in the district. So yes, their work is very important. Commissioner Griffin, and then do we have anyone online? Commissioner Griffin, and then Commissioner Santiago.
I agree that this particular committee should be sunset. However, I have grave concerns on the overlapping of administration in our district right now. And I have concerns about where our DEI is and things of that nature. So for the most part, I think some of it should be outsourced for hiring purposes to ensure that we are covering everything under that governs human capital. But I do agree that it should be sunset, but then I have concerns about the employment processes that are happening within the RCSD. And with that being said, I think we definitely need to make some meetings to address these concerns before we sunset human capital, because that will make me feel more comfortable about moving forward with it. But right now, I feel that there's things that need to be addressed efficiently, effectively, in every, that's just my biggest concern. Once we do that, then I agree.
Okay.
I agree.
And I'll share a couple of things, and this is one of the reasons why I know you wanted to have this conversation early on in the process. Fully respect that. One of the things that I'll share is that part of the reason that we have you as a board go through setting goals and guardrails first before having this conversation is that you as a board can make a decision about what are the values of the district that you want to make sure the superintendent regularly reports on to the board. So this will be a choice that you all can make. I'll make a recommendation to you, but it's a choice you can make whether or not it becomes a guardrail. So if human capital is something that you're concerned about, then the board should say as a collective, we are concerned about this, so we're going to create a guardrail around our DEI, our equity hiring processes. By creating that guardrail, what the board is saying is, superintendent, we want you to regularly report on this guardrail and give us feedback, and it becomes part of the guardrail and reporting process. But you as a board would collectively have to make that determination. Does that make sense? So the reason this is kind of a preliminary conversation is that you may, because of the timing of everything, decide to sunset the committee between now and January, but it won't yet have been defined as a guardrail that the board has selected overall. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
how the timing of how everything will work will be your biggest challenge. Understand exactly what you're saying, but it is a board decision about whether or not this is of value that we want to make a guardrail. You don't have to make that the decision tonight. That's not why we're here. So no need to comment on that. That's not why we're here. Commissioner Santiago.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree that it should be sunset.
Okay, thank you. Any others? Yes, ma'am. Commissioner, Vice President LeBron.
Yeah, I just want to also agree that it should be sunset and, going back, everyone has concerns in this district. Look at our outcomes. We should all be concerned. But again, that hasn't produced any outcomes. So sunset for me.
Okay. Any others care to I think the consensus is around sunsetting. Any others want to weigh in on Human Capital Committee?
Same for time's sake, sunset.
Yeah, sunset. I like that you talked about a collective decision as a board, how we form the guardrails, because I was just thinking, when you said guardrails and you can start, I was like, man, we're going to have a list of guardrails, but the fact that it has to be a collective board, it feels better.
It's a collect. The guardrails are not just a list of everybody's
Right.
desires. It is
Yes.
3 to 5, or 1 to 5 actually. You can have one guardrail, but it's what you're asking the superintendent. Mr. Superintendent, this is what we value. So don't operate outside of. Yeah, what community, not what we value, but what the community values. And this is what we as a board feel should be a guardrail, but it's collective. Next committee.
I think if there's nobody else who's going to say something, I think CIGR is a good one to also go over. I believe that CIGR should be sunset. It's a good committee that goes over great things, seeing that some of the issues that the district face and, the board face that may be barriers towards, our student outcomes are sometimes legislations and legislation that we can't control, whether it's on the state level or the local level, that holds the district back from achieving certain goals. But I believe that can be turned into responsibilities with the board instead of an entire committee. So I believe that the legislative agenda, the legislative breakfast should be kept. And we should continue advocating in Albany like we do with the other big 5 districts. But I think that should be a responsibility to certain commissioners than an entire committee. So I believe it should be sunset.
So for the purpose of those who are streaming, CIGR is the Community and Intergovernmental Relations Committee. And Commissioner Santiago has suggested that one should be sunset as well. And just so you know, all of our boards, there are things that you cannot do legally as board members as it relates to advocacy, et cetera. But going to Albany, supporting and meeting with others that you can do legally to help move the district's needs forward and help bring attention to the district's needs is always a part of board work, but not necessarily in the form of committee as well. Any others care to weigh in on
I would agree with Commissioner Santiago and that it can be sunset.
this one? Can be sunset.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Agree.
Agreed. Anyone else?
I want to agree too.
Okay, agreed. Anyone else? I think we have consensus, sunset. Anyone else like to address the next committee? Yes, sir.
When are these sunset effective dates? Because I think next Tuesday we have a CIGR meeting.
My understanding is that you are having this conversation to make adjustments in how you do committee assignments in January. So it's my understanding that January is when you have the committee assignments, when you make decisions about who chairs each committee. So the notion of sunset is beginning a process. And again, sunsetting committees is a process because what you've got to do is put in place things that will accomplish any work that is necessary that the committee was doing. You can do that in other ways. So you've got essentially the month of November and the month of December to make those determinations, and then January is the sunset timeframe. Is that correct? Am I correct in that understanding? I see heads nodding. Okay. Two more that I'm aware of, unless there's more that I'm not aware of. Which committee would you like to address next? Finance. Finance and Resource Allocation
Finance.
Committee.
Can I jump in on that one first?
Absolutely. Vice President LeBron, go ahead.
So I've already modified, but that is, again, another committee that could be 100% modified and done monthly at the board business meeting. That's all. And it should be done monthly. Do we need to read the reports publicly every month? No, but I do think every other month, the CFO should still be presenting. And I don't even think he should be presenting how they're currently presenting. I think it's more like a high level overview, perhaps pointing to, and I'll use my own board as an example. I have my finance person come in and present to my board every month and just give high level sort of like, here's an area that we all should be paying attention to, but everyone gets a written report with documentation. So that's all.
Okay. So sunset, the recommendation is sunset with an augmenting of the reporting structure to the committee during the monthly business meeting?
Correct. And we've already modified it, so we have an example of what that looks like as we move forward.
Okay. Any others care to weigh in?
I agree.
Yeah,
Commissioner Malloy just agreed. Go ahead, Commissioner Santiago.
Yeah, I will also agree that, some of that can be done in our business meeting or our work sessions, and so it doesn't need a individual committee.
Okay. Any others?
Agreed.
Commissioner Simmons said agree. All right. Yes, ma'am. Commissioner Griff.
So just for clarification, we are modifying the financial, you're asking to modify the financial or sunset?
The recommendation, and I can't remember if you were in the room, I apologize, but I'll repeat it. The recommendation was to sunset, but to take some of the modifications that have been already done or to modify the CFO's presentations around budget so that they occur during the regular business meeting, but modifying what gets shared, how, and the information you get, but making it a part of the regular business meeting rather than a separate committee. Am I correct in that understanding?
Yeah.
Okay.
Business meeting
Well,
work session.
Well, I mean, for me personally, I know it might be tedious for some people, but I like to see will we still be getting the budget breakdown, or we're just not going to be doing the presentation in front of, like on a Tuesday or the last Thursday in the month? Is that what is being said? I'm sorry.
I don't know if go ahead, Commissioner Santiago, and then I'll
Well,
answer that.
if Vice President LeBron can
what-
speak, because it is her committee, she can explain what she was saying.
I
I
already
think-
explained. I'm not repeating myself. I'm sorry.
She did at the beginning, but what she was sharing is that they've made modifications and that that presentation will come not in a separate committee, but in the business meeting with the modifications that have been laid out. What I would share is that you'll still get the same information, just not in a committee format.
Okay, that's all I was trying to clarify. Okay, thank you, Doctor. I appreciate it.
And I was also saying is the work sessions, and that's something that Vice President LeBron was saying also is also doing it in the work sessions when it comes to the budget and stuff like that, because those are more meaty conversations, and so those can be done in work sessions outside of a committee setting.
Thank you.
Thank you. And good point. I think I'll make the point for all of the committees, even human capital, whatever committee it is. If the superintendent or the board feels like we need an update on some major element of the operations of the district, the board can always ask for work sessions where you get an update on that major element. Here's where the district is going, et cetera. That should be a normal part of your business.
So potentially, we could even set it up where there's a standing work session that would maybe supersede all these committees, right? So it's a work session dedicated to certain work that would probably be the same timeframe that one of the committees was anyway, work through these items and have one board business meeting. And so then that's like essentially 2 meetings per month versus 20, right?
Yeah, I would not recommend a standing work session because a standing work session is going to quickly evolve into another standing committee meeting.
Okay, gotcha.
So, but work sessions, like, for example, it can be once a year on a particular topic. It doesn't have to be on a regular basis.
Gotcha.
And they're also on an as-needed basis.
Okay.
So that is the Committee on Finance and Resource Allocation.
I'm sorry, can I just add before you move on to the next or final committee? I just want to add to what Commissioner Simmons was saying and what you were saying, because we've had that experience. We did that one year where we just pre-schedule work committees or work sessions or board study sessions, they used to call them. But again, legal said a meeting is a meeting. And you're right, that's exactly what happened. They got jam-packed with a bunch of other topics at times, topics that stem from one meeting. It created a whole entire work session where we went off on a tangent. But what I would like to suggest before we move on is, as we're having the conversation about creating a day in the future, I do think it's helpful for the board to identify, and particularly for staff who have to chase us down to try to figure out if a certain date and time works, that we make a commitment that if a board committee, if a work session has to be called, that we are all in agreement on the date and time for the future. It could be like, yes, on Tuesdays, we know we may be called for a work session because that's the day that we're all going to agree that we're going to have this work session, but then staff knows that that's the set time. Because again, when I started here too, we were having meetings Monday through Friday, and the committees were not committees of the whole. So there were times where board members were there 5 days a week. It was insane.
So can I just ask for a question for clarity? Vice President LeBron, I heard everything you said. I just wanted a point of clarity. So you're saying, like, if let's say Tuesday at 6 p.m. is not a standing meeting, but that is if we need to call for a work session, we know that the second Tuesday of a month at 6 p.m. could potentially be the work session time if we need it?
Correct.
Gotcha.
Yes. And then
Okay.
we, as all of us as commissioners, have that sort of already blocked off, if you will. That way, when our board staff have to schedule, and we would know, obviously, because we would all be in agreement as the board and with the administration, but that they don't have to do these doodle polls and chase people down to respond so that we can get a date. I just want to speak for our staff who do spend their time doing that and how incredibly frustrating that can be.
So thank you. I'll leave that up to you to figure out what your structure needs to be. So I think you can work with your board staff to figure out what that structure looks like, what works best for you all. So we won't, so you want to make a comment?
If I could just make a quick comment. One item that is not on the standing committee agenda that we do have monthly is a special meeting for consideration of resolutions, which happens the second Tuesday of the month after the ESA committee. And so you all would need to make a decision about what happens with that meeting as well.
So that can be, that I'm assuming when we listed committees, that would be one of them. I don't know if that's a committee meeting or not, but so we can address that one. I have one other committee. Is that correct, or are there other committees that we haven't covered? One more?
One more.
Okay. So if we can move forward, go ahead, Commissioner Malloy.
So the last one is the policy committee, and I would say this committee, the work that's being done there could be done in work sessions, to have a policy work session as needed. So I think we should sunset it. I think a lot of the conversations devolve sometimes into really input and adult focus instead of we're not really dealing with our guardrails or our goals at that point. And I know that setting policy is required by law for boards, but we can do that in perhaps a different format. That work doesn't need to take place in its own standing committee.
Okay. So Commissioner Malloy has shared that committee could be sunset. Commissioner Griffin.
I guess for me, reading so much about the policy and how we're not governing the policy, I think if one was to open a book and really read what we're doing versus what the policy is stating and how it really works for the students, I think that one would look at it a lot differently. I know it's very, very important, policy is, and it follows up with NYSBA and the school law. So they all work together. I read them. So when you're not just looking at policy, you got to reference back to the school law and everything else when you're reading the policy that is governed for our children. So it's a very important policy. What I would agree on, for me, I think would be feasible for all of us to play a part in it so they can see exactly what is in those books, because we need to govern what's in those policies in the school law book and what NYSBA has out for our children. If we did that, we probably would be in a better position. That's for me, after what I've been reading through the 3 books that's governing all these districts in New York State. It is very, very important for us to get those policies that come out and people want to make changes to them. You need to read through how it is affecting those children and compare it to how it's affecting other people in other districts. Because if you did that, I think for me, it would be a totally different outlook. What I'm finding with myself is that going through the policies and what we have out is totally different and out of line and out of sync with other districts. And we're going against the policies that are at hand, and we're making a lot of protocols, which is causing educational breakdown, educational system breakdown, because we do not know the policies or we do not understand the school law and everything that governs what we have for our children in this district. So for me personally, if you haven't opened that book and read it, it would hit different. It hit different if you take the time to read what I've read. So for me, I think that all of us should play a part. If a policy is going to be changed, we need to all break open those books and read those books before we make a change. That's my decision. I would never sunset policy. Policy needs to be dealt with.
Okay.
And it needs to be dealt with for me in the right way. Thank you.
So what I hear you saying is that it's very important to read through and review all of the policies, particularly for each individual commissioner, and that's a critical element of the process. I'll also go back and ask where we started, the original question, is a committee to read and review the policies required by law?
So if I can weigh in. So no, and I think, there's a lot of folks that have been here for a little while longer who probably read it and have read we all got an education law book, and all have been well-versed in studying the NISBA policies, and some of the policies we have in our district were actually adopted by other districts, or that we've adopted from other districts or by other districts. So it's a shared process, so I just want to make sure I clarify some of that. To answer your question, no, I don't think it has to be done in a committee. Matter of fact, I would prefer that it not be done that way.
So is it required by law? Is a policy committee required by law? Go ahead. Hands raised online, so I can't tell whose hand is raised. Oh, Commissioner Santiago, is that whose hands? I'm sorry.
Could you finish your statement, though?
I'm old and blind. I apologize. So my statement is: remember, the question was, is it required by law? Number two, is it related to the board's work around goals or the board's work around guardrails? I know we aren't there yet, but those are the three questions you want to ask yourself. So is policy development related to one of those three solely? Commissioner Santiago, thank you.
Yes, I would say for the policy committee, me personally, I believe that it should stay in committee, but it should be modified and changed in the way that, it has been discussed, and even in the way that has been reviewed. Because, and the only reason why I say that is looking at, I think that now that we're dissolving a lot of these committees, there's going to be a lot in work sessions and a lot in business meetings. And the business meetings can be retweaked and reconfigured the way that is currently written out to focus on some more of our responsibilities. But I believe that policy does focus on our responsibilities as a board. I think that, it can be done in a different way regarding our committee, but I think for the discussion that it takes, it will be a lot better in committee in comparison to work sessions or business meetings. But I believe that it could be modified differently to where it's a lot better regarding around the way that it's discussed, the way that it's read. I think that, we all, when we came onto this board, we all have the New York State education book, law book, the New York State law education book. We've all studied it. We all get the emails from this, but we all look at that. So I believe that we're well versed on that. But I also believe that it should be kept regarding just because of the discussion that it takes, but it can be done differently.
So suggesting that you keep it and modify it. Two questions for you. First of which is, again, is this committee all the board members, or is it's all of the board members? Okay. Second question I have for you. Do you all have a process in this committee for ensuring that all of your policies are regularly reviewed on a cycle? Okay, and is that part of the work of this committee? Okay. So with those two, what I hear you saying is keep, modify, but ensure that the work of the committee focuses on the process of modifying and making sure your policies are either what's required of the board by law and updated to address what the board might need to do in terms of supporting your goals and your guardrails.
So if I must say this, so if we have a draft of the policy, every member should get that draft of what changes are requesting to be made on a policy and why these changes are going to be made. So when we get that draft, we should all be getting that draft, reviewing that draft, and going through and see how it would affect or not affect our student outcomes. I think that for me, I think that would be a great idea, so people have an understanding of what is being looked at there. It's not a bad thing; it's a good thing to depict what is going to happen, how it would affect our student outcomes. So again, modifying it so that it's just not myself who was the committee chair, but taking it and giving it to the board, let them read it, go through the draft, and and submit what the changes, what they think should be changed, or do a Zoom or do whatever. But I think that it's just not as simple as all the other all the other committees. So, it takes work and it takes time. So I think that, it's a good idea for all of us to go in and read what needs to be changed or what is being asking to be changed. Not necessarily should it be changed, though, because it still comes to a vote, right? So I think that's a good suggestion for us to modify it in that fashion so that everybody is reading that draft and seeing what changes are being made and why.
Okay.
So let me just interject that there are 3 readings that the policies go through. First reading, and if there are any questions, we get an opportunity to ask them. Second reading, if we have any questions, we get a chance to answer. There's a third reading, and then the vote comes.
Okay.
So it goes through a 3-month process, all right? So that's already what we do.
Okay.
I just want to make sure that that was clarified.
Okay.
All right.
And
I
then
think
I'm
Commissioner-
assuming that each of your, and I see,
Everyone, every
I
board
see
member.
Vice President LeBron, your hand is raised as well. I'm also assuming that as you go through that process, once a policy is revised, a date is automatically set for when that policy will be revisited, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Vice President LeBron?
Yeah, I'm in support of eliminating, and to President Elliott's point, that process was in part created by Commissioner Bunches when she was on the school board in her 1-year tenure, because policies weren't really being reviewed in a timely fashion. And the goal was to get through every single policy, which we have accomplished. I think Willa Powell sort of championed that when she took policy back over from Melanie. But those readings, first, second, and third, are often squeezed in the business meeting. And again, if we eliminate reading reports, if we eliminate a lot of the things we do in the beginning of the meeting, then we can focus on these things in that structure and still do the policy readings. I'm in favor of eliminating the policy committee and restructuring to put it under the board business meeting.
Okay. Thank you, Vice President LeBron. There's one other thing I might offer as a potential modification, if you will. Quite often what you can do, and particularly given the fact that you already know how many policies will be reviewed each year, now that you've been, I'm assuming from what I've heard, you've been through all of them. One of the things you could do is say this committee starts at this time, so same with the audit committee. Remember how we suggested with the audit committee, there's a start point and an ending point? It could be that you have a starting point and an ending point for that committee each year, where you'll start the review process for policies. It will go through a particular time period. You'll have the first, second, and third reads, and then you will stop the committee at some ending point so that it doesn't start up again until next year when you need to do your reviews. So it may be a committee that doesn't need to be an ongoing all year round committee, but it's a committee that runs from point A to point B. It has a beginning, it has an ending, and then you move on. Does that make sense to everyone? Mm-hmm. I don't know if that will work for you, but just a suggestion.
Just one more statement. I just want to ensure that because we get these, with the readings, before we get the readings, there actually is a draft that comes up. And I think the most important thing here is that we have time to read those drafts on the changes that are being made on those policies before the meeting itself.
Yep.
So that's my biggest thing, is just making sure we can read through these and everybody has a clear understanding of what is being presented and what is being changed that affects our students, because that is crucial to me.
Yes.
That's very crucial.
So I think-
Go ahead.
So I think what I hear you saying is the important thing is making sure we have a process in place for how we review and
Absolutely. No
modify
one
our-
person should be controlling the fact of policy, because these policies are crucial to our children and their outcomes. So we need to make sure there is transparency when we're sunsetting something. It's something as strong as policy. We need to make sure and ensure
Yep.
that the policies are, the drafts that are being done for any changes are given to us prior to, for review, before that first reading, so that we can make sure that we're governing what we need to govern, and every T is crossed and every I is dotted for our over 20,000 kids.
Got it.
That's my concern.
Got
And
it.
it shouldn't just fall under the business meeting. It could, because it shouldn't fall just under a business meeting. And that's another concern. It shouldn't just fall at the end of the month. It needs to, we need to make sure that even if it's being read by Raheem or whatever, it doesn't matter to me. It's just, I want to make sure that we are doing what we need to do to govern these children under the policy that is outlined by U.S. Department of Education.
Got it. Understood.
Yeah, I would
So-
also say that, go ahead.
No, go ahead, President Elliott.
Yep.
Am I missing someone? I'm missing a hand?
Vice President LeBron.
I put my hand back up.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Vice President LeBron. I'm sorry, I can't hear you either.
No, it's okay. I just want to point out, because I'm always conscious that the public is listening to these conversations as well. And I don't want the public to be confused about the fact that there is already a policy for the board on how they review policies and a procedure to that policy. And board members are also, there's also a policy for how the administration has to give board members information in a timely fashion as well, so that we can have time to read and digest. And I just want to clarify, for the first reading for policy, that would be when we get the first reading. We typically get that emailed to us, and then it's uploaded on board docs by the staff well in advance before we're coming into a meeting. But again, board business, just like other school boards across New York State and across the state, do policy in their board business, because that is the definition of what we should be doing, is board business in the board business meetings. But what has happened over the years is that we've spread it out. We used to do awards, all kind of crazy wonky stuff from wonky board members as well. So I'm okay, again, standing on eliminating it and keeping the policies that we currently have in place for the procedural and the reviews. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I hear you saying is keep the processes that you have in place, but modifying the committee structure. But when I say modify, keeping the policies in place, you're saying sunset the committee. What I propose to the board is, clearly, I think there's consensus around modifying how the policy and review committee operates. And is there consensus around, over the next few weeks or months as you wind down this year, modifying what that policy and committee structure looks
Yeah,
like,
if I could
but
just
keeping
also,
the procedures in place?
yeah,
Go
let me
ahead,
just
President
also
Elliott.
interject that, we're talking about either sunsetting committees or modifying them, and
Correct.
then do a lot of this at the business meeting. And I just want to point out how heavy that business meeting can be. If we talk as much as we talk in committee meetings, I see us being here the next day if we're going to perhaps talk about all of this committee work in the business meeting. So I would have my colleagues to be mindful that, of the level of work that can go into the business meeting. But I will also point out too, that people who are around this table, particularly those of us who have been here a while, we do read the information. So it's not that we, that, as it was stated, that we all need to read it. No, we're reading the information. So I just want to be clear about that, that most of us, are reading it, and we've been around in order to know what, we are involved in and what the decisions that we have to make. So
And I think
I would just share that we just have to be careful, because I could see us, again, like I said, being here till the next day. Thank you.
And I think one of the reasons that we have, again, what we have, what you'll see on the timeline is a review of the agenda and it's a process. Remember I said we're going through a process. So we will build into the process reviewing those agendas to make sure that you're not overwhelming yourselves in that business meeting with other information.
And then, but the other thing too is that we also need to look at, if we're modifying it, we also talked about maybe returning to the 3 commissioner format. And so that's something that we also have to consider as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Malloy?
I agree with those sentiments. Thank you so much, President Elliott. And I would also say that there are times during our business meetings when we're on a first reading or a second reading where it doesn't generate a lot of discussion, right? And it doesn't take a lot of time because, we've read through it and we agree with how something is worded. And so sometimes those parts of the meetings can go rather quickly. And then other times we do get bogged down. And it's also our responsibility to do a lot of that reading, obviously outside of the business meeting time. And so coming prepared, certainly helps with that. I think, though, that a lot of this work, for the reason why I had suggested sunsetting the committee instead of just modifying it, was that a lot of the work could be done in a work session. Because I think of what's on an actual agenda from month to month for policy, and just given the cycle that we're currently on, I don't know if it warrants a separate meeting on a monthly basis. So maybe we modify how often it meets, because we're not always talking about specific policies at those given meetings either. And many of the topics sometimes are adult-focused, and then lead to really long meetings where we're perhaps arguing with one another, instead of actually creating policy or modifying policies.
So Commissioner Santiago is next, and then Commissioner Griffin.
Yeah, I'll just agree with both Commissioner Malloy and President Elliott. I think that it would be good to modify the timeline instead of this committee meeting every month. Like you said, Dr. Hart, is modifying the timeline as far as when this committee is meeting. And again, I just think that adding it to a business meeting or the work sessions, it just leaves a lot of room for overpacked schedules and agendas. And then also sometimes they're not getting the focus that it needs, because sometimes even in the business meetings with the readings, by the end, usually it's focused on by the end of the meeting. And by the end of the meeting, everybody has gotten to the discussion between presentations and resolutions and all of that. And a lot of times it can get the back burner. And so I think having the separate conversation about it is important and does allow us to really focus on the policy and how important the policies are. And so I don't agree with sunsetting it. I believe in modifying, the timeline of the meetings and making sure that we're focused. And, we just, I believe in keeping it.
So, I just want to make this clear to the listening public as well. I am no means trying to say that my colleagues are not reading. I don't want people to think that I don't think they're not reading, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I have read a lot myself through the policy. I can't tell you what you've all read. That's not for me to say. I'm saying what I have read and what information I have gathered throughout the time that I've been here. I have to go back and forth to different books to understand exactly what is going on, because it refers you from one book to the other, right? So let's make that very clear. I'm not trying to criticize anybody or try to tell them that they're not reading. I'm just saying, for me, there is a lot of reading. I've read a lot, and I know I had to go back and forth for hours and hours. It doesn't take just a half an hour to read that and understand it. So if you know law, law takes you everywhere, So in school, the school policy book, the policy book itself takes you to different places. So that's what I'm referring to. So I just want to apologize if I offended somebody, because that's not what I was here to do. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Understood. Madam President? President Elliott?
Yeah, I forgot my thought, so you have to come back to me. Yeah.
So what I have, if there's no additional discussion, what I have is, for now, modifying the Policy Development Review Committee. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, if I could just interject not about a commissioner, I just wanted to interject. I heard a conversation around the timeline for policy, and I just want to remind commissioners that the policy committee currently meets 4 times a year. This is not a monthly committee.
Okay.
We
So
address
it's a quarterly
policies
meeting.
almost
So it's a
monthly,
quarterly
yes.
meeting committee. Okay, perfect. So that's helpful. So what I hear is potentially modifying the Policy and Development Committee, really looking at what the committee does, how it's structured, making modifications. I will go back and give an overview of all, if that's okay. But what I also heard is the audit committee is required by law, but modifications there about what gets discussed is warranted. What I also heard is the Government and Intergovernmental Relations Committee beginning the process of sunsetting that committee. The Equity and Student Achievement Committee, what I heard is for now modifying that committee, the types of reports, the types of presentations that are made during that committee as you move into the January timeframe. For Finance and Resource Allocation Committee, what I heard was sunsetting that committee. And for Human Capital, what I heard was sunsetting that committee. Is there anything that we've missed or any committees that the board has that we've missed that you'd like to bring up, Commissioner Patterson?
I think the only thing, and I might be out of order, you might be doing it later on, but it's, have we really truly discussed committees of the whole? That being part of a committee diet, or, you know, reducing it from 1 to 2 to 3 members. I don't think we've discussed that. And then I'd be interested once again, and we might have already gone over some things, but not all. Again, when you talked about what are these structures or other ways of reporting out, your suggestions, you know, per committee, and other ways that we could report out other than the business meeting. So do you have anything else other than that? And it doesn't have to be tonight, but at some point in time. Thank you.
What our recommendation would be at this point is taking the next 2 months to have conversations about what does the sunset look like? What does it look like to begin to offset? Does this go to a work session? Does some of the material here go to a work session? Does some of the material here go to the business meeting? So that's not something you have to decide tonight, but now you've given yourself a 2-month window to make those determinations before you get to January. And then regarding the other committees, if you want to talk about kind of committee of the whole or any other committees, we can raise that. I don't think we necessarily need to bring it up tonight, but we can talk about it as we go if you would like to as a board. We're happy to do that with you. Commissioner Malloy?
Thank you. It's just a question regarding policy, because I know just in my training with council for the Great City Schools, the policy diet, like where does that come into play? Because we're taught, okay. So obviously, by keeping the policy committee, there is still going to be discussion around implementing a policy diet as well.
There are 2 things that we're going to talk to you about as we go through this process. If you look at the red section, it says development established process. It's the red section on the color-coded board information. You'll see there, item number 2 is conduct a board policy diet. But we put that toward the back end of this conversation for the very reason that this committee conversation usually starts at a later part of the process as well. But I think it's healthy that we had it now, particularly given that you're going into January. But that board policy diet is, again, a review of your policies similar to the conversation we had tonight about what's inputs, what's outputs, what's outcomes, what's board work, what's superintendent work. Can we review our policies to make sure that the board has policies that are dictating board work and making sure that your policies are focused on that? But it occurs after you've had an opportunity to begin to transition the conversations that you have during your board meetings, transition the focus of the work, and then going through and having that policy diet conversation.
So I would also want to put on the table for our consideration. One of the drawbacks may be is we're doing this, we may lose some of our oversight and not have the ability to ask some of the kind of critical questions when we're in the committees. And, you know, whereas if we're doing this perhaps all at, in the business meeting, you know, people may not be as alert to really ask the kinds of questions that they would ask in a committee meeting. So I would just put that on the table for our consideration, that we may be losing some oversight and we may be losing some ability to really ask some of the critical questions because it is a business meeting. We're thinking holistically about the business meeting itself as opposed to specific issues around academics or specific issues around finance or specific issues around policy. And so, you know, just to put that on the table as we move out and make decisions about how we're going to move forward in our modification or in sunsetting, that we also take that in consideration as well.
So, Madam Chair, I would offer 2 and you'll feel this as we go through the process. So just want to make sure I clarify both for you and for the public. At no point are we going to suggest that any individual board members give up their right to ask any questions of both the administration and staff. Our objective is to help the board focus on those things that are important to the board as a collective, rather than having the superintendent and the team changing based on individual requests consistently. And we'll talk more about that as we go. But by no means are we suggesting or advocating for in any of our processes that you lose your individuality as a part of the process.
Or even the board as a whole, you know.
It's
so-
the board as a whole. And so what we're focused on is what the board as a whole requests, which is why I think earlier the conversation about guardrails, what does the board as a whole feel are the values of the district? And so it helps you focus, and that focus for the board will add significant focus to the administration in what they're able to accomplish and how they're able to move things forward for kids. And that's where the process will feel different to you, but you won't lose the individuality.
Okay.
To President Elliott's point, which is a very good point, I must say. But for me, I think that, you know how we usually take a break, we do an hour or something, we take a break. I think that to make sure we're covering those areas, even though we don't have the committees, maybe do it in, like this hour we're doing this, and the next hour we're covering that, so that we are still giving the public transparency in those different areas, but doing it in a different way, where we're on a time constraint and getting everything modified. By modifying it, we can reduce the time, but people can still address those concerns with having like a break between the two. You know, so that's just a suggestion, so that, to President Elliott's point about making sure that we're still addressing those concerns of the public, and we're doing it in an effective manner, in a timely manner, and we're not all going into the business meeting at the end of the month and making that a long, drawn-out meeting, because then we lose focus and we lose people.
Yeah, if you remember during our conversation, during our two-day retreat, and we'll start to wrap up, but if you remember during our two-day retreat, we mentioned to you that 51% of the board's time should be focused on student outcomes and your goals and monitoring your goals. The other 49% of your time can be focused on the other issues that the board needs to address as a whole with the community. But 51%, we'll be moving toward this. You're not there yet. But 51% of your time focus on student outcomes, but it doesn't negate the other conversations that you need to have as a board. So we're not advocating for that. But what we will push you on is, again, the board making collective decisions about what's important, not individual decisions, but collective decisions about what you want the superintendent district to focus on. Mr. Superintendent.
Mr. Hurd, two things. One, I did want to go back to Commissioner Malloy's point. A lot of our policies are tied to countless and countless reports that have to be done in addition to all of the other presentations that are getting done. I like reading, but it's very difficult to make sure that we're putting out quality and making sure that we're doing right in terms of transparency with the public and reporting out on the information the way it should be. So I would ask that there would be some consideration around the policy diet pieces to be pushed up in tandem with this conversation around these committee diets, because, you know, again, there could be less committee time, but then I'm just replacing that time with doing policy reports. And it really does take a toll on the staff as a whole. And then two, we have a special meeting that's after the equity and student achievement meeting that we didn't touch on, that I just didn't want the board
What meeting is that?
to. It's the meeting after the ESA meeting. We have a special meeting after the ESA committee of the whole.
Second Tuesday of each
Yes.
month, ESA meets, and we have like a 20-hour meeting, and then
That one is
after
quick.
that,
I like that one.
we have this long meeting, all right, and then after ESA concludes, we move into our special meeting, which is facilitated often by President Elliott, and we go into special business. pieces there.
So may I suggest that as you modify the ESEA meeting, or the ESEA? That's
We know
federal
what you
government.
mean.
Sorry, ESA. That's my other hat. The ESA meeting, that you revisit modifications to that post-ESA meeting as well, and are you all comfortable with that?
Can I just
Special
jump in
meeting?
real quick because that special meeting exists because the administration does not have their stuff together for the board business meetings. They don't have all their resolutions. You know, in the past, different administration has stated that it is because, you know, they hired someone, we passed a policy essentially, or exempt the policy so that they don't have to bring forth those resolutions for our teachers, paras, TAs, bus drivers, and so forth. But the meeting really was created out of administration not being on time to have their resolutions by the board business meeting. Just want to point that out.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually getting ready to go there because I got tired of, and this was a previous administration, but yeah, I got tired of accommodating the student-focused outcomes meeting, right, ESA, on these other supplemental
'Cause it was taking up-
pieces.
taking up
Yeah,
time in
it
that
started to
meeting.
take up a lot of time, so that's where it came from,
Okay.
correct.
So I think,
Or if they don't get to a committee meeting, there is the 48-hour rule that they may request that we suspend.
okay.
So we have to take that
So
into
it's a matter of making sure the administration has put in its own sets of guardrails, if you will, around timeline, timeliness of when the board.
Correct.
Yeah, when the board gets the materials they need to review for vote. All right. Yes, sir.
Can I just make a comment? For me, as a former superintendent, I had 2 study session or work session, and I forced my staff to have every resolution ready for those work sessions.
By a certain date.
So by a certain day, if they were not there, sorry, but it wasn't gonna go to the board, to the business meeting, so they will have to wait until the next month. But they knew that they needed to have it ready by the work session. We have 2, one on academics and one on finance and operations. So every single resolution went through those work sessions.
Yep, and that's how most of our districts operate that way. So I think when I talk about modification, I think modifying and making sure the administrative team modifies what they need to get to you as a board can perhaps address the needs of that second meeting. Any other meetings that we haven't considered or addressed? We'll continue to work with you. We'll continue to work with the administration as well on the modifications here. Just note that there may be some things that we say, all right, we're going to modify this, but as you begin to make adjustments to the regular business meeting, you may come back and revisit it and say, hey, we figured out how to do this differently. And so the modifications that we've made can begin to lead to a sunset if necessary. But what I hear is that beginning in January, you'll have 3 modified committees. With a modification to the ESA process that occurs, or the meeting that occurs after the ESA process, and then 3 sunset committees. Madam Chair, did you want to?
Yeah, so for the next 2 months, are we to work on this by ourselves, or are you going to?
No, we'll work with
Okay,
you. We'll
together.
work with you
Okay.
on it. So that's part of what I wanted to. That's part of what I wanted to talk to you about. So there's 2 things that I wanted to wrap up with. The first of which is, well, 3 things. The first of which is I started off with the implementation plan, giving you a modified implementation plan. One of the things that we would ask is that at your convenience, and we'll leave this up to the clerk, but review it, ask us questions about it. If you'd like us to make modifications to it, please let us know. And then we like to ask you to adopt this formally as a board so that we're all on the same page moving forward. You can do that at your convenience. The second thing is how you would like us to move forward with the process. One of the things that we have noted at the top, and this is item number 2 in the green area where it says develop and establish clarity. There are 2 ways that we can go about doing this. We can work with board leadership. We can work with the full board, which is so far been our process. We come up, work with the full board, or in between meetings, For example, in working with the board members to get the survey that we sent to you completed, in working with board members to get, some of there's going to be a review of scripts, there's going to be review of documents that we share. One of the things that we often recommend is perhaps 3 people work with us, and then those 3 people work with the full board, rather than working through your board clerk to push you. Your board colleagues are pushing you. I will leave that up to you, but it's one of the things that may help moving forward as we make requests of you. We'll work with the 3 board members to work through some of the details, and they will work with you as board members rather than having the board clerk share everything with you. But just want to put that out on the table for how you all might want to work with us as you consider the timeline, timeframe over the
Yeah, I
next year
think
and a half.
that it is important that we adhere to the timelines that you recommend. So if we were supposed to get that survey done, we needed to have gotten the survey done. I think that, I think it may be best to work as a whole.
Okay.
Because that gives responsibility to each individual board member and for us to work together. So that's what I prefer, but at the same time, we all have to do what the directions from Council of Great City Schools, we've got to make sure that we're doing that. And we're not able to do part of the work that we were to do tonight because we did not get the survey completed. And so, we got to do the work. And so we can't, and then I don't know how much more money that's going to cost us if we're not doing what we're supposed to do. So it's just important that we are we're responding, and we're responding timely. That's going to make it a lot simpler for Dr. Hart and for Cindy. So we got to do that. So. Right. Anything else, Dr. Hart?
That is all. There's one of the, well, that is all. That is all. So, Madam Chair, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Any other questions from any of the commissioners? All right, thank you very much. We got something else? Oh, did we start with the motion though? Oh, okay. So is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by Commissioner Simmons. Who seconded? Commissioner Griffin seconded. All in favor? Aye. All right, thank you all. Great work. Good night. Good night, Commissioner Santiago, and they're gone. And